All right, Bergson and the Holographic Theory of Mind, ongoing series. This will be part 36. Is experience stored in the brain? The third segment on this. Or, another way to look at it, does the brain need to serve as the suitcase in which we carry around our experience? Or another way to look at it, we're looking at the very common orthodox assumption that indeed experience is stored in the brain, that it is the suitcase. So we'll be looking at the model of Moscovitch and Nadel. And we'll see in their world, it's a static world. We'll see the mythical fractions of events stored and the notion of ever useful neural continuity. We'll look at the notion of the schema. What is it in their conception? The notion of consolidation, the very notion that the brain is chemically driving the storage of memories. What happened to it? The subtle move that we see in these authors to the virtual, Bergson's notion of the virtual, and in general, the creaks and groans of a dying hypothesis. That is something that is only an hypothesis, though a dogma. We resume the heretical, absurd question. Is experience stored in the brain? I note down on the right there, my initial long discussion of this subject was number 16, and other places, the most recent being number 34, that I've discussed this. What does the current state of memory research tell us about this question, especially via its focus on the critical role of the hippocampus? Of course, we know Bergson's answer. Experience cannot be stored by the very nature of perception, by the method by which the perceptual image is specified. Bergson, given the state of knowledge at the time, gives little positive prediction about the role of the hippocampus or the hippocampal complex, but something we shall see later. But we have seen that there could have been two general constraints on memory theory, one that derives from Bergson, the other more particularly from Gibson. From Bergson, this constraint, experience is not stored in the brain. We are four-dimensional, time-extended beings. The past is a four-dimensional structure whose essence is to have a date, that is, it is inherently ordered. Every event in my experience is ordered by the very nature of the flow of time, where each present instant reflects an entire past history. The flow cannot be disordered. Try the disorder, coffee stirring. Then from Gibson, with a little bit of Bergson thrown in for interpretation, events are dynamic, in constant change. Events have a structure of invariance, as we've noted many times, velocity flow fields, adiabatic ratios, inertial tensors, etc. There is no interval, no matter how minute, how infinitesimal, in which there is not constant change. There can be no static instant. A time invariant, that is an invariant defined only over time, does not exist in a static instant or set of such. These two principles or understandings would have entirely changed memory theory. But of course, these two principles do not exist. Nevertheless, as we noted in number 34, theory is being forced to these, and we will see this now even more. We're going to look at a 2016 model, almost early 2017, which captures the current state of theory by Moscovitch, Cabeza, Winokur, and Lynn Nadel. Nadel is important in the concept of the hippocampus, HPC, hippocampal complex, as key in spatial navigation or cognitive maps. Moscovitch and Nadel are key in challenging the consolidation role of the hippocampus, where the hippocampus is key in storing experience. That is, hippocampus drives consolidation, supposedly. Also bring in a 2018 talk by Nadel. We're just going to visit some major topics in this paper, in this review, or this model. So the start of the model is in perception, stage 1. The model is called the component process model. And it's illuminating to see the start, because it starts in their vision of the world that has to be remembered. To quote, during perception, sensory information is progressively bound into feature clusters in early sensory regions, then into integrated objects and context in late sensory and cortical MTL regions, and into complex events binding objects with their spatio-temporal context together with the feeling, phenomenology of experience in the hippocampal complex. So they begin with an essentially static view of the world, binding features, the binding together of features. Now this is exactly what Hummel and Biederman in their 1992 model noted would not work, as they considered how one would recognize a Cuban cone, for example, when the Cuban cone is conceived to be composed of features, vertices, edges. And they noted that, well, we've kind of got a Humpty Dumpty case here. Humpty Dumpty falls down and we can't put it back together again because there's no map as how to put back the features. They're all jumbled. They've all been stored somewhere in various spots in the cortex or some other place. You've jumbled those features, and now, well, that jumble right there on the bottom half of that illustration show that, well, they can still be called Cuban cone. How do you get Humpty Dumpty back together? Just because you have the features of the Cuban cone doesn't mean you have a Cuban cone. So remember, they tried to solve this with their notion of geons, elementary geometric objects like bricks and cones, which served as a kind of map to put these features back together. In essence, in other words, a kind of picture on the puzzle box that helps us to figure out how to put the puzzle back together again, the little pieces, the little features. But as we noted, that collapsed miserably as well. That doesn't work. I discussed a lot of this in my article on time and memory and dynamic form in Consciousness and Cognition in 2004, for anyone who cares. So, to quote again, during perception, sensory information is progressively bound into feature clusters. But we've seen this totally destroyed when we view a rotating cube. Remember, we're dealing with flow fields. The flow field as we travel toward the sun there, the flow field defined over the rotating ellipse. Notice a rotating ellipse is resolved into a series of vectors around that rim, or the flow fields defined over the cube as it rotates, our Gibsonian cube. And so these features, the edges, the vertices, are just sharp discontinuities at the junctures of these flows and can disappear. As noted when we strobe that rotating wire cube, bottom right there, out of phase with its symmetry period, it becomes a non-rigid plastically deforming object. The rigid edges are gone, the vertices are gone. Likewise, the rotating ellipse now becomes a wobbly, plastically deforming kind of not an ellipse. So these features, quote unquote, do not exist in a static instant to be bound together in a static cluster. But they go on, and these are then bound into complex events, binding objects with their spatial temporal context, together with the feeling, the phenomenology of experience in the hippocampus. An amazing statement we'll look at in a second. But the rotating cube is already a complex event. So this model is simply the classic metaphysic, which cannot work in a subject like memory, which is so intrinsically bound to consciousness. You have to be able to bind two instants, one to another, to have any consciousness whatsoever. That's where it all begins. So they're off to a bad start. The memory theorists simply refuse to admit that they must start with the theory of perception. Perceiving a rotating cube is already a problem of memory. So again, keeping that quote up there, the spatial-temporal context. Yes, the spatial-temporal context, whatever this truly means, is going to be critical. We've already discussed this in number 34. But this, together with the phenomenology idea, is an absurdity. It's another index as to how far off these theorists truly are. Your brain dynamics better be specific to the time-scaled form of the field, as we've noted, to a buzzing fly, or heron-like fly under a different time scale, or to coffee stirring. Should not have to be binding these clusters, etc., to the phenomenology, whatever this could mean. I mean, somehow you're saying you're binding clusters of features to the very way the coffee looks like. That's the phenomenology. That's the experience. Is the phenomenology of coffee stirring, of buzzing flies, just floating out there waiting to be bound to features or neural states? I mean, this is a boggling statement. Why not bind fairies and unicorns to the clusters then? What the heck? This is the event they are trying to explain via progressive binding of static features, as we noted again. The structure of invariance laws, velocity flow fields, acoustical invariance, texture gradients. This major deficiency will haunt the discussion we're about to see. So, moving to stage 2, to quote, the same regions remain active for a while due to top-down modulation from the prefrontal cortex, which allows the persistence of object and context representations. Note the persistence, as well as unified event representations within working memory. So, this is the standard move. Explain the continuity of the perceived event via the continuity of neural oscillations or neural activity. So, and again, since they're in the static world, they're basically thinking about that nice static cube sitting there. Its features are being held together as we look at it, bound together by this ongoing neural activity, resonating, so to speak. And of course, that's the persistence as well. So the persistence of that cube is neural activity in front of us. So difficulty here, put the cube in rotation. Make it a dynamic cube. Now, as we know, since they're working within the classic metaphysic, but failing to grasp its implications, each present instant, as this cube rotates, falls instantly into the past. That is, into non-existence. So at every point, if you imagine with that cube rotating, every instant, and every little motion of that cube, instant to instant, that present instant falls away into the past, into non-existence. Therefore, how is it preserved? Well, it's the brain. The brain, defined as matter, is always present. Therefore, it must run to preserve that past instant that's falling away into non-existence. This is the very reason why they are storing the past in the brain. This metaphysic is this extremely simplistic little model. Past falls away into non-existence. We must run to store it. And the brain's got to do this because it's always present. But this is the difficulty. The brain, too, with its neural oscillations, only has the existence, the time extent of one of those points. That is a mathematical point, because those points in ultimate extent, taken down to their finest, smallest point, is a mathematical point where there's actually no time at all. So neural oscillations, being part of the material world, part of the material brain, can be of no extent. So they cannot explain the perceived continuity. So yet we have the classic metaphysic being used to motivate storage in the brain, and simultaneously ignoring the classic metaphysic being used to explain time-extended perception. In other words, as usual, as it's just continuous, they're trying to have their cake and eat it too, and they're never making themselves aware of the metaphysic that they're actually working in. So, stage 3, next stage. Quote, during encoding, a fraction of transient representations in working memory are transformed to a long-lasting format in the cortex and in the hippocampal complex, which is to say they're saying these go into long-term memory, long-lasting format, and they're stored in the cortex and the hippocampus. So what do they mean by a fraction? Well, there's my 2-week canoe trip over there on the right. Canoeing through various lakes, catching fish, cooking fish, or hot dog there, etc. But only a fraction of that can go into long-term storage, apparently. So we'll just cross out some of those events. Only the arrows without the X's go into the cortex there and get stored, long-lasting. Well, what's the principle for that? What's the principled mechanism for the selection of this fraction? There is none. The same thing is true of a simple event like coffee stirring. That's 2 minutes as opposed to 2 weeks, but what portion of that event, what portions are being stored? What's the principle for the selection of some set of chunks, segments, whatever, being stored in the brain? See, this fraction thing is just a convenient mythology. And as we saw, and shall see again, saw in 34, this flies in the face of highly superior autobiographical memory, where you have individuals where everything is recalled down to what was for breakfast on 11/28/1975 in detail. And this means for these memory theorists that this fraction selection mechanism must be entirely turned off. And everything must be stored to the most minute detail in the brain. So which is it? Now, a quick overview of the final parts of this model. Stage 3 continued. The rest of stage 3, the hippocampus becomes an index, pointing to the storage addresses of these events, the fragments of the events at multiple cortical sites. So again, looking to the right there, the coffee stirring the cat is looking at. Fragments of that event, the features of the event are stored at various parts of the cortex. I guess the spoon, the plate, the form, the clinking. Again, I doubt you could find a principle by which this is done. And, of course, the index has to be pointing to multiple sites for each instant of the event. Once we make it dynamic and the event is ongoing, and since you're storing slices, you have to have slice after slice after slice of the event, each one broken down into the arbitrary components that you are storing, for which you have no idea where these components come from. And somehow within that, of course, you're somehow trying to preserve, in this Humpty Dumpty broken down fragmentation, the velocity flow fields, the adiabatic ratios, the inertial tensors, the acoustical invariants, the texture gradients and ratios, etc. And remember, this event is dynamic, constantly changing down to the most infinitesimally minute interval of time. So again, you're down to having to store, well, mathematical point extents of instance of each of these slices. But the problem is a truly static scene with determinate values at an instant, as we just said, is a fiction. So everything in this theory is based on a fiction. All from the classic metaphysic. Then there's stage 4, retrieval. The hippocampal index, or better, multiple indices, must be engaged, and therefore reassembling the experience from the multiple cortical sites. So, having completed this quick overview, there's some interesting aspects of what I'll go into. The first is the schematization, not consolidation. Consolidation, the authors still cling to this, but barely. Barely. Consolidation is the concept that the hippocampus is somehow chemically driving storage of an event into the various cortical sites. This hippocampus driving is needed for some mysterious, unspecifiable length of time. Sometimes, apparently, lifetime, 70 years. Considered a major problem with the theory in reality. And I say, but barely cling to it. The discussion of consolidation in their model is minuscule, near zero. And I suspect that even the bowing to consolidation was perhaps a bone thrown to this standard theory. Or perhaps they just didn't have room in the paper to deal with all the ins and outs of it. But as we shall see, consolidation actually starts to disappear into the concept of schematization. In Nadel's 2018 talk on the history of hippocampus research, he noted there are two possible views of reconsolidation. One, physiological, i.e. neural reverberation, chemical modulation. And secondly, psychological, rehearsal, reactivation, reintegration. But that latter view, the psychological, he notes, was lost for years. But it is to the psychological interpretation rather than the physiological that they entirely turn. This psychological view they term schematization. An example, again, my 2-week canoe trip in Canada. I relive or remember it, recall it many times over the years. I tend to remember catching the big walleye, capsizing in a rapids, a monster northern pike, huge waves in Basswood Lake. The point is, these are actually new events, memory events, but new, unique. Each successive time that could be viewed as reinforcing a certain pattern of retrieval, a certain set of events within the canoe trip being recalled over and over, a schematization of the trip. And this schema is considered cortically stored, that is not stored in the hippocampus. Now a couple of implications. This schematization notion explains the Reball curves, where the older the event, the more resistant it is to amnesia. So if we look at the graph at the right, where the point of trauma is at the origin of the graph, and we move back into the past, in the years preceding that trauma, notice that the number of events, the percentage of correct remembrance, is going up steadily for both normal patients and amnestic patients. So, in fact, if the trauma was at age 70 and we move back 50 years prior to the trauma, we've got very resistant memories, increasingly resistant memories to the trauma. But the idea is it's the cortically stored schema that is surviving. And this is analogous to a semantic memory, where, for example, I remember that, or I know that St. Paul is the capital of Minnesota, or the US has 50 states. These semantic memories, too, are very resistant to amnesia. So we don't need consolidation then, secondly, to explain the curves. Previously, the greater resistance with age was attributed to longer consolidation processes, driving metaphorically the memory nails deeper and deeper, this chemical consolidation in the brain. The difficulty is, if you look at the graph, we're talking like 50 years of chemical consolidation, or 40 or 30, depending on how far back into the past. But this is for each and every event that ever experienced, ongoing continuously. So this, as a conception, is sort of getting a right. Now, schematization implies some notion of a schema, and at this point I must issue a warning. The notion of a schema we just saw, like a pattern of recall, a certain selected set of events from an event, what we saw is just about to be greatly changed. Two versions. Schema 1, a pattern of retrieval of the same event, as I noted. I recall my one canoe trip again and again in a certain way, certain selected events. It is a pattern of retrieval. But version 2 of schema, an invariance or set of such invariants over multiple events. Invariance over multiple canoe trips or over multiple coffee stirrings, as we've seen before, and we'll hit again. Both are valid, but the authors simply switch subtly from one notion to the other, as we're about to see. So now we're going to go to schema 2, that is, what's in effect a concept. So how do they define it? Well, a schema is an adaptable associative network of knowledge extracted over multiple similar experiences. So, coffee stirring. The function of such, to make predictions about what to expect in a given context, to aid in interpreting events that occur in that context. So, while I'm happily stirring coffee, I expect coffee stirring to act normally. The surface to circle around, the cup to stay stable, to feel a certain resistance, etc. But that enables me also, that schema of coffee stirring, that concept, to notice new details that do not fit the schema, like these. Okay, coffee jumping up and down, going over the, mysteriously being able to hover above the cup there, funny looking smoke, colored, etc. And I know what they've just said is just a restatement of the frame problem we've noted before. This is just, remember, how does the robot recognize when things are changing that shouldn't have changed, when that funny looking coffee cup going over the top there is not to be expected, not an expected event. And I've noted that is a function of the invariant structure. And another little problem, which details are you storing? Then if you're still sticking to fractions being stored, which details? Because all can be relevant. Anything can now be relevant in a dissonance context like we're seeing there. And they say, for example, one may have schemas of what kitchens are like and what one does in them. Walking into a strange kitchen may produce a novel episodic memory for the kitchen and for the local events that transpire there. Schemas ensure that the experience of being in the kitchen is not in itself strange, but relatively predictable. Sound familiar? So, what one does in the kitchen, schema. What one does is stirring coffee, cooking eggs in a frying pan, eating eggs with a fork, cutting a stack of waffles or pancakes, spooning cornflakes. Oh, of course, Homer's having a little bit of another one of those anomalous events there. He does his cornflakes. Each of these is a dynamic invariant structure. Just the coffee stirring is just one example. All of these have dynamics and invariants, which cannot exist in instance, which cannot be stored statically. This dynamic event structure is the starting point, as I've already indicated, for all memory theory. Ignore it, your theory is diluted. How are you actually storing these events? How? One would think they cannot escape this much longer. Right. Don't hold your breath. So yes, as we've seen, coffee stirring as a concept is invariance defined over multiple such events. Anomalous events fail to resonate. They create a felt dissonance with this vast structure of invariance that defines coffee stirring. There's another one. Lack of resonance, dissonance. And we get nestings and clusters, of course, what one does in a kitchen, a bunch of these things, making breakfast, a bunch of smaller things. And as noted, to support analogy, or even a dissonance as above there, you need all the details, the entirety of these events. For any aspect, any invariant can emerge in an analogy, as we noted in number 6, where Hofstadter was amazed at the analogy, bending over to pick a trivial item up off the ground before a majestic scene. As he sees a friend bend down and pick up a bottle cap or something in front of Karnak there, and he's reminded instantly of seeing his son bend down and pick up a little thing while standing at the Grand Canyon that his son thought was interesting. Picking a trivial item off the ground before a majestic scene. An analogy, but you better have everything stored to make that analogy. Which otherwise, how did you know what fragment of the event to store? So, those details. The role of details in the model is interesting. Memories are transformed, they say, from detailed to schematic. Well, some memories, some remain detailed. The hippocampus is critical to detailed remembering. That is, very detailed experiential remembering. Quote, insofar as memories remain detailed and retain their context specificity, they will continue to depend on representations encoded in the hippocampus, regardless of their age. And both types of representations can coexist, interesting, and dynamically interact, so that a memory that has previously been manifested in a schematic rather than a detailed form can regain its specificity with appropriate reminders and once again engage the hippocampus. Now, much was in that last. For example, both types of representations can coexist and dynamically interact. But if the schematic form of my canoe trip can interact with the detailed form and bring it back, isn't this admitting that the detailed form, the original experience, was never lost? Let that sink in. This is the implication of the now ever-lurking, highly superior autobiographical memory. There is clearly an individual condition where all experience is retrievable. It is never lost, manifestly so, and where schematization is a non-factor. If I can restore the experience with specific cues, it has never been lost. And then another piece of that quote. The schematic memory can regain its specificity, its detailedness with appropriate reminders and once again engage the HPC. Now, what can this even mean? Having regained its specificity, its details, means in their coded language, we are back to the original experience. Shouldn't the schematic be engaging the HPC, the hippocampus, such that the hippocampus can now bring back the detailed experience? But no, they're saying it's the original experience that is engaging the HPC, the hippocampus. 180-degree different from what you'd expect. I hate to say this, but read this way, you're back to Mr. Bergson. We have a virtual object or event in time. My canoe trip experience, attempting to impress itself, quote unquote, engage the HPC, impress itself on the hippocampus, where the hippocampus must provide the spatial matrix for the event, for its scenes, for its dynamics. So we'll come back to this virtuality. Now, where does Eleanor McGuire fit? The subject of our discussion in number 34 for the entire discussion. Well, this latter point, the hippocampus providing the spatial matrix, the clothesline, so to speak. Remember the patient saying, it's as if I have a lot of clothes to hang up in a wardrobe, and there's nothing to hang them on, so they all fall to the floor. Remember, he was trying to visualize a scene. That was his task. And so they all fall to the floor. It's in a complete mess. And another patient saying, there is no scene in front of me, There's no visual scene opening out in front of me. They can't visualize scenes. The patient's being hippocampically damaged. So they note, Nadel, Moscovitch, etc., episodic experience, that is, a canoe trip-like remembrances, is always in spatial context, thus the importance of the hippocampus. And the scene construction thesis of McGuire is brought in here, but no other attention to this is given in their model. Though, as we discussed in number 34, it is obviously absolutely critical, not to mention, as we noted, Cassir's thesis that the hippocampus somehow is part of a key in supporting a mathematical group, spatial motion, and providing a fluid center such that one can visualize. So again, focusing a little more on the details, engage the hippocampus. What can this even mean again? In his 2018 talk, Nadel spoke of remote memories. To the extent that they are vivid, they activate the hippocampus to the same extent as recent memories. Again, vividness being a code word of these theories, shall we say, for the original experience. So activate that hippocampus. Again, this is killing consolidation. The hippocampus is reacting to an event. In 4D being, if we took this in Bergsonian framework, in both cases. He also says it is the vividness of the event that excites the HPC. So it's the vividness that excites the HPC. And he notes the details correlated to the vividness and details equal the same thing, are not stored in the hippocampus. And he ends in that Taylor and DeSiena hypothesis theory that the hippocampus is an index, as we saw in previous slides. An index is the storage of multiple zillions of cortical sites, which I think is kind of just this, a bone to standard theory. But the difficulty is, when we look at it, so we have the vividness, the details, the experience engages the HPC, and simultaneously, the hippocampus is the index that retrieves the details. In other words, complete contradiction. Gobbledygook. So, in the model, what is the explicit memory of the past? How do they explain explicit memory? That is, what is underlying the conscious localization of a past event in time, of one of our past events? There is no answer to this question. Their vague binding of the phenomenology to the hippocampus and cortical processes is an index of how lost they are. They envision the hippocampus working together with the prefrontal cortex, as I've noted earlier, to achieve explicit memory, explicit episodic memory, the explicit memory of my catching a walleye in my canoe trip. The prefrontal, that contains the larger context, the schema, the invariance over many events of coffee stirring in the kitchen. Notice again, there's a different form of schema, schema 1 versus schema 2. But we get the picture. And then the hippocampus, what they call the local event coherence, spatially. So it's responsible for holding the event, the coffee stirring together, and other aspects of coffee stirring together spatially. But why this conjoint mechanical process should yield conscious remembrance, that is, anything more than a complex mechanical process, they don't know. That is, why would I have anything more than a robot? Surely we can bind phenomenologies, so to speak, quote unquote, to a robot's computations too. So, as far as I can see, given their model, my cost thesis still holds. It just makes actuality far more complex than their willing to explore. That is, cost being the interrelated complex of concepts, causality, object, space, and time that Piaget describes as a dynamic developmental trajectory over 2 years the child has to achieve, that the brain requires to achieve this ability, localization of events in the past. And of course, with such a complex dynamic, there must be points for breakage. And you still need an articulated simultaneity to account for explicit remembering. I consciously localize in my past stirring coffee in the kitchen yesterday. Else you just have a machine, a robot loading a schema, so to speak, into place. But this requires Bergson's temporal metaphysic, mind intricately embedded in the indivisible transformation of the holographic field, as I've noted. In my favorite little example of explicit memory, I notice wind chimes tinkling on the porch. This redintegrates an experience, holding the tinkling wind chimes in the store, buying them as a present for my wife. The present buying is a virtual event within the 4D extent of my being, residing there in the 4D extent. All the dynamics underlying the articulated simultaneity supporting this explicit memory, holding the event together, the present event together with the past event as a simultaneous whole is needed. But note, the brain, the hippocampus here, is engaging, the old engaging with a virtual event in time. We're explicitly acknowledging this here, an event in my 4D being. And I note this interaction with the virtual bringing about action in the body, an essential aspect of Bergson, impressing itself by successive degrees upon the systems of the brain I've discussed already heavily in number 9 in free will, number 31 language, especially in the context of the dynamic scheme, where the dynamic scheme, another creature of four-dimensional being, is bringing about, say, a dance, learning to dance, or speaking a language. Now, this interaction with the virtual is, in my opinion, what Moscovitch and Nadel are, in effect, dancing around. So, conclusion. Is experience stored in the brain? Is this position an hypothesis, but exalted to a dogma still so obvious? Obviously not. In truth, it is now strained to the max. It creaks and groans, hidden by ever more vague, ever more incoherent statements, like binding to the phenomenology, or detailed experience engaging the hippocampus. What we are seeing is the verification of Bergson. Whether experience is stored in the brain is critical to the problem of consciousness. Are you storing every instant of an ongoing perceived event? The rotating cube, the paddling down the lake, the stirring coffee? You must do so in the storage model, given your metaphysic, where each instant disappears into non-existent. You must. But are you disassembling these events then into static features, storing each feature in an extremely short-term memory, then reassembling all these features in real time as the event is ongoing to achieve perception of the event? Then what happened to this structure? The invariant structure, yes. The case of the missing invariant structure, that little specter that haunts all of memory theory. And still, by your metaphysic, this does not help you. You still cannot explain continuity, the perception of a time-extended event, stirring the coffee. So for once, state how perception can actually work in your theory of memory. And please recognize this, perception is experience, is consciousness. A theory of memory must be a theory of perception, and equally, simultaneously, a theory of consciousness. But what have we seen? Nadel, and Moscovitch theorizing as though memory is a separate subject from both. And we just have to sort of talk about binding phenomenology to everything else that memory involves. This is badly, horribly misguided. The fact is, current theory has no idea how experience is or can be stored. Add in, it totally ignores invariance laws. That is, Gibson. It lives in this nice little safe space where we don't have to worry about the dynamics and the laws defining events. Then there's the death of its consolidation theory. That is, any semblance of chemical driving of memories into the brain. It's indefensible fragments of events stored, utterly unprincipled. Its theory of the explicit memory, totally zero. And finally, it being a theory only of the a static world. The reality, theory is being driven to an entirely different model. A postscript. I discovered 2 YouTubes recently from the Australian version of 60 Minutes. The first one, people who remember every second of their life, total recall. This happens to be more cases of highly superior autobiographical memory. So one finding, and there's findings now because researchers are starting to take this phenomenon seriously as a phenomenon. The finding, the caudate nucleus is 7 times normal size in these people. Now looking at Wiki, the caudate nucleus, nothing obvious leaps out. It is hippocampus connected, but most everything is. But it's highly involved in suppressing action. But this is yet another thesis of Bergson. To recall the past, one must suppress the natural call to action. We'll talk about that in a second, but it's like one needs to move into a meditative state, for acting interferes with pure recall. We're leaving the present to travel backwards mentally into the past, into that 4-dimensional being, aspect of our being. Waking up, acting, stretching, drives away a dream. One should stay still, trying to recall the dream. So the natural call to action is in reality this principle, virtual action. Bergson's principle, perception is the display of possible action. The natural orientation of our system then to action must be suppressed. We're again leaving the present with its call to action, perception action, to travel backwards into the past. We're avoiding the call to the present. We're avoiding it. And it's quite interesting then that these superior autobiographical memory folks have a caudate nucleus, a structure that's specifically oriented toward suppressing action, suppressing this call. So just an interesting note. Another finding, these folks usually seem to have some obsession. For example, a special need for order. But the real problem, the hidden implication here, is that everything is stored. But how can everything be stored? Well, silence, utter silence. Second YouTube, the woman who woke up with foreign accents. This is termed foreign accent syndrome. Perhaps 80 people around the world. In the 3 people that were discussed, all spoke perfect native English originally. One day, each fell sick. The next day, they were talking with thick foreign accents. One sounds Russian, another very French, a third very Chinese. And when I say very Chinese, I mean this woman could no longer pronounce R's or L's. She manifested all of the difficulty Chinese show with speaking English, when they're not brought up natively speaking it. This is curiously resonant to me of the discussion on Memory of Spiders in number 26, where we talked about the sudden acquisition of an entire language. Sitting in the restaurant in France, and suddenly the entire conversations all around are completely clear, the meaning thereof. Though here we're dealing with a new structure of accentuation. It's as though this whole new structure of accentuation of a language has been loaded, or now accessible, or now the one that is accessed, just like the language schema. So just again, more mystery. That is to say, memory way beyond the current framework of orthodox thought. So next, we'll see. Till then, signing off.